Welcome to Chapter 5. We are on the other side of the Civil War, and in this chapter, we are looking at how people move out west and settle the West. The title of this section is Cultures Clash on the Prairie. Of course, you know, and I know, that the West was not vacant space. There are a lot of Native Americans and Mexicans living there, and there will be culture clashes as Western, uh, as settlers push west, I should say. Okay, so first slide. Let's take a look. Um, this slide is about what was already happening in the West. We're looking particularly today at the Great Plains, which is this area. This is a grassy area. You can see here, dry grass. Mostly flat, makes up a big portion of the middle of the United States. Number of tribes inhabited this area, and those tribes were very dependent on the horse and the buffalo. The horse was very useful for transportation and also for hunting, and the buffalo was a life source for the Native Americans. They used buffalo for all kinds of things. They used it for clothing and for shelter, the skin of the buffalo. They obviously used the meat of the buffalo for food. They would carve tools out of the bones of the buffalo, really not wasting anything. They kind of it was a life source for them, just like very dependent on the buffalo. At this time, can pause the video and take a quick look at the buffalo video on the other screen. Okay. This next bit is about family life. The Native Americans lived communally. That means they lived in groups and family groups, and they didn't own the property. There wasn't any sense that one family owned one part or another family owned another part. It meant that everybody just shared, and everybody used what they needed as they needed it. That is going to become an issue as American settlers move in, and they're very concerned about who owns which part of the land. Native American tribes have no idea how to answer this question because, of course, everybody owns it, or nobody owns it. Everybody just uses it. They live together. It does not about ownership. And of course, we know the way they view the land is more than just property, right? It's the thing that sustained them, right? That gave them life. It was generational. They understand kind of the longer, bigger picture of living with the land. And so that is going to hold more significance when people come to take their land or to push them off of their land. They have stronger ties to this land. Okay, I think we are ready for the next slide. So here come our settlers, right? Here's our definition of manifest destiny again. These very entitled American settlers pushing west, right, because it's their destiny to do so. And of course, the whole time they're doing this, they are encroaching on native land, right, pushing them off, and there's going to be a number of conflicts that we're going to look at today. Some of the reasons they're moving west, right, because of course they feel entitled to, but also there's a number of places where there's a lure of silver and gold, right? So smaller gold rushes that happen than the one in California. There's also one in Colorado, but then also a lot of people just want to go and settle and farm and claim their land, and that is kind of a thing. The settlers push westward. And so, right, here's where our conflicts are going to begin. Let's take a look at how they conflict. So the government shows up and oftentimes with troops will try to restrict Native Americans, push Native Americans. And the pattern of this sometimes had happened that first people would show up with like treaties, right? So that was like you'd have somebody who came and somebody signed something. They agreed to leave in a certain number of years, or they agreed to stay, but the government owned the land. A lot of trickery and deceit. Um, Usually, right, unless people just kind of walked away from the land, the U.S. military was sent to physically push people off of their land holdings and onto reservations. There is a very powerful picture in your book, if you have it with you, on page 205 that I suggest you take a look at that shows you the native land holdings in 1819 and then how they look in 1894, and then the map goes all the way up to even 2000, and you can see that even up until this, even in this latest century, the government continues to restrict Native American land holdings. You can see how small their land holdings get over the course of the 2 centuries. So anyway, page 205 in your book, you can take a look at that. Um, Oftentimes these fights are bloody and they are not fair. One happens, the massacre at Sand Creek, right? The information is here in 1864. And General Curtis, and there's a picture of him in the book as well, kills 150 people, including women and children. On the Bozeman Trail, the Sioux tribe engages with multiple battles with the U.S. military. At some point, right, they are pushed to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which says that the Sioux will go onto reservation, but it's not signed by their chief, Sitting Bull, never signed by him. And so, anyway, we're going to see the Sioux and the U.S. government continuing to have battles moving forward. Let me see here. This next slide, right, a little bit more. The Red River War in 1868, the Kiowa tribe and General Sheridan went through and destroyed villages. There was another gold rush around this time in the Dakota Hills, if anybody's ever seen or heard of Black Hills Gold, and a new rush of settlers pushed into South Dakota. There's one famous battle with General Custer, who I have pictured here, and he, I don't know, I forget the numbers, but he had something like a few hundred soldiers, and he attacked a few thousand Native Americans, kind of just assuming that his weaponry was better or his soldiers were better, and he and all of his soldiers die. So this kind of becomes like the General Custer is kind of the butt of a lot of jokes, but this is not the norm. This was like the one time that Native Americans kind of like beat all these U.S. military. For the most part, these are very sad stories where the U.S. military is actually attacking Native American tribes in their homes. So there's a lot of like there's a lot of death of women and children and family. It's not it's not the kind of fighting, again, just soldier to soldier fighting. This is the military pushing people off their land. Okay, so this gives us these last couple slides a sense of some of the fighting that's going on. There's a lot more than this, but just to have a sense of a couple of the tribes and a few things that have happened. What is the government's approach once they have this land? And what do they do with native peoples that they've captured or they've pushed onto reservations? The government goes ahead and supports this, a vocabulary word here called assimilation. And assimilation is the idea that you can blend cultures, right? And what happens here is, to some extent, both cultures, you know, become one. Obviously, in this case, this is like with the intention of having an American, like a stronger American presence for these natives. What kinds of things are we blending? We talk about blending cultures, language, religion. How do we use money, right? How do we have transactions? What do we eat? Stuff like that. And so the government passed um, certain laws, like the Dawes Act, to Americanize the natives. And there's very sad stories that go with this. But they almost as soon as they get them onto reservations, right, laws like the Dawes Act actually break up these reservations and start giving plots to each individual family. Um, and this is very confusing for natives because this is not how they thought of themselves, and this is not how they thought of the land. Um, According to this American law, every family could get 160 acres to farm. And of course, Native Americans didn't farm, they weren't farmers. That's not how they were using the land, and it's not how they were living. They were following buffalo and hunting them when they needed them and sort of living on the land as a whole and not as individual property. And so, anyway, this was difficult for the natives, this kind of land break. And the result here is that there is a massive land loss for tribes. And this is convenient for the US government because they can give each individual native family their land, and then, of course, if there's leftover land, and there's a lot of leftover land, the government will take that land and then they can give that land to white settlers. So it's a little bit of a bait and switch here. Um, Other things, right? And we'll look at other laws, but Americanizing natives. A lot of natives, this picture over here is from a boarding school where natives were forced to learn English and wear white people clothes and eat certain foods that they probably wouldn't have eaten and do a whole bunch of things that they would have never done and learn obviously Christianity and other very like American uh, things that were part of like American culture. Um, and so this is boarding schools, and we'll in Annenberg Media will take a look at one of these boarding schools, and pretty awful and traumatizing experiences for a lot of people. The other thing that happened as the settlers moved west is the extermination of millions of buffalo, and this was actually what forced a lot of natives off of their land, even without a war. As the settlers just killed off the buffalo and left them for dead, um, many Native Americans had nothing to eat and literally would roll into these reservations starving. Would just come there because there was no food. They had basically exterminated an entire species. Sorry, had exterminated an entire species of animal.